Okay, we're going to look at the portions in a nutshell. Matot Masei, double portion. Final portions of the book of Numbers of the fourth book of the Torah. And just even before we do the summary, a lot of this book is going to be, a lot of the portion, especially the second one, is going to be retelling of everything that happened in the last 40 years, because it's a summary. So it lists all the journeys. So there's some form of summary that happens at the end of this parsha. Okay, the name of the parsha is Matot, means tribes, and is found in Numbers chapter 30, verse 2. The name of the parsha, the second parsha, Masei, means journeys, and is found in Numbers chapter 33. Okay. Moses conveys the laws governing the annulment of vows to the heads of the tribes of Israel. That's a legal section in the beginning. What is it doing here? We'll talk about. But there's this whole section about what happens if somebody makes an oath, makes a vow, which basically says, I'm not going to do something. Let's say I'm not going to drink wine, or I'm not going to engage in this behavior, that behavior. And then so the Torah gives you a formula where it could be undone. It depends. Sometimes the father can undo it. Sometimes the husband can undo it. Sometimes the court can undo it. There's all kinds of ways. So we can talk about that, but that's the law, and that's the opening section. Then we read about a war is waged against Midian for their role in plotting the moral destruction of Israel. And the Torah gives a detailed account of the war spoils and how they were allocated amongst the people, the warriors, the Levites, and the high priests. So that actually takes up a nice section, a big section of the parsha, exactly how much spoils, how many things they took from the Midianites, from the war, and how they divided it. And the principle was that it was divided not only amongst the people who went to war, but not only amongst the soldiers, but amongst the collective Jewish people. And there's a teaching there that when you go to war, it's not, looting means I'm taking for myself. We don't believe in looting, right? We say if you're going to war, if it's a justified war, it's on behalf of the entire people, right? It's not you as an individual, it's on behalf of the entire people. Okay, so that's the war. Then we get to an interesting episode, which Moshe is very frightened by, but it ends up accepting it. And that is that at this point in the story, the Jewish people already conquered vast amount of land outside of Israel, because there was they were at the border of the Jordan River, which is the border between Jordan and the land of Israel. It wasn't called Jordan then; it was called whatever it was, Ammon, Moab. And the point is that the Jewish people, there were two kings that tried to stop the Jewish people from passage, and the Jewish people conquered their land. So some of Jordan and some of Syria was already conquered by the Jewish people. And now two tribes approach Moshe and say, we have plenty of cattle, and this is wonderful land for cattle. It's not great for agriculture, but it's great to raise cattle. So they say, please, can we stay on this side of the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan, outside of Israel? We don't want to cross into Israel. Now, if you're Moshe, that's a disaster in the making, because what happened 40 years earlier? Moshe sent the spies to see Israel. Spies came back and they said, we don't want to go. God got so upset, and God said the whole entry into the land was delayed for 40 years. It was terrible sin, the sin of the spies. So Moshe sees this happening again. So Moshe gets totally upset. But then they talk about this, and it's not clear who misunderstood who. But the end of the day is they say, no. We're going to go to battle in front of the rest of the people. We'll be first when we conquer the land west of the Jordan, of Israel proper. And then if we do our part of the deal and we help conquer the rest of the land, then you'll give us the land east of the Jordan. And Moshe says, okay. And that's also a big discussion. So I'll read that. Of course, you could read the story of what is the inner significance. We can talk about all of this. The tribes of Reuven and Gad, later joined by half of the tribe of Manasseh, which is another story. Moshe does this. Moshe takes the tribe of Manasseh, cuts it in half, and puts half east of the Jordan, even though they didn't ask for it. So that's also strange, because Moshe didn't think this was a great idea. So he agreed to do what the two tribes requested. But why is he now, on his own initiative, putting half the tribe of Manasseh across the Jordan? So that obviously means there's some theme happening here. There's some purpose for this. In any case, the tribes of Reuven and Gad, later joined by half of the tribe of Manasseh, ask for the lands east of the Jordan as their portion in the promised land, these being prime pasture land for their cattle. Moses is initially angered by the requests, but subsequently agrees on the condition that they first join and lead in Israel's conquest of the lands west of the Jordan. So if it's a deal, by the way, in the halacha, in Jewish law, there are ways to figure out how to make in a contract, how to make a condition. And there are 6 rules of how, there are 6 details that a condition, a condition that's legally binding. Like if I say, I'll sell you my house if you make a condition, the condition has to have certain criteria for it to be binding. It has to be stated in the positive and the negative, all kinds of laws. All that is derived from this story. Because when Moshe makes a condition, he makes a condition with them. He says, if you go, and if you lead everybody, then you'll be able to get the lands east of the Jordan. So in halacha, it's just interesting that where it's derived from. The laws of contract and laws of conditions are derived from right here. Okay, so that is the first of the 2 portions that we have to address. We should have made the class 2 hours because we have 2 portions. It's not my fault that we have 2 portions. Now I have to squeeze 2 portions into 1 hour. Okay, but God will help. In any case, that's one portion. Now we get to the second portion, Masei, which is the final portion of the 4th book, and Masei means journeys, and we literally recount each of the 42 journeys, the places where we rested, because we know that we traveled, even though they traveled for 40 years, but they stopped in 42 places, and the Torah now lists each of these 42 places. So the 42 journeys and encampments of Israel are listed, from the Exodus to their encampment on the plains of Moab across the river from the land of Canaan. So that's the first section. Gives us the history from the Exodus, from leaving Egypt up until this point. And then the boundaries of the promised land are given. And cities of refuge are designated as havens and places of exile from the inadvertent murderers. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. Go ahead, Dr. Tamron. We have one more point to make, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Rabbi, this is something I never thought about before. You've talked a lot in recent weeks about the qualities of leadership. And today you're talking about warfare and conquering other nations. So my question is, does the Torah ever talk about the role of Moshe in warfare? Did he run up San Juan Hill like Teddy Roosevelt? Did he stay in the background? They always say the leader is the one that has the spear in him. So was he the one that was up there putting his life at risk, or was he in the background? I mean, does the Torah say anything about Moses as a military leader?
Yes, the Torah says, it's interesting. Moses, in the beginning of his career, was not really a military leader. The first time that they were attacked by Amalek, which is right after they left Egypt, Moshe himself did not lead the troops. In fact, he told Joshua to find people and lead the people that will go lead a defense team and go and defend against the attack of Amalek. Also in this week's parsha, when he goes to war with Midian, it's not Moshe himself. Moshe sends the high priest, and Moshe himself does not go to battle. It's interesting that I'm just thinking about this now, that in the story with Amalek 40 years earlier, the Torah makes the point that whenever Moshe would raise his hands in prayer, that's when the Jews were victorious. When Moshe lowered his hands, the Jewish people would sort of lose. In other words, would retreat. So what they did was Moshe was praying on the mountaintop, but he couldn't really hold his hands up. So he had Aaron, his brother, and Hur, his nephew, hold up his hands, and that's how they were able to pray and be victorious. So hold that point in a second. However, when it comes to the lands east of the Jordan that the Jewish people conquered, that Moshe led the battle. Moshe led the battle against the 2 mightiest kings of the region. And the commentaries explain that Moshe was afraid of this battle. But he didn't tell the Jews he was afraid. And the Talmud contrasts that to the king of Balak, who frightened the king of Moab, who frightened his people. So Moshe led some of the battles later in his career, even though he was a much older man. He did lead the battle. And I'm just thinking now that maybe the Torah is signaling to us that a battle has 2 components. The battle has the military aspect and the courage that it takes to lead people in battle, but it also has the spiritual component. And that's why when Moshe was younger, and you would think, oh, now he's fit for leading battle, that's when he's in prayer. And he's standing on the mountain, and all the people look to Moshe and see Moshe's hands are upward. And the Mishnah makes the whole point. Moshe's hands make the difference. No, Moshe's hands don't make a difference. But if the people are in the plain fighting, and they see Moshe on the mountain lifting his hands heavenward, then they look heavenward and they think about Hashem, and then they're victorious. So Moshe here does the spiritual component, right? A battle is the tactical and there's the practical side of battle, but there's also believing in believing and having confidence that you're going to be successful and that you're fighting for a just cause. So having the morale of the battle is also important. So there's a spiritual component and there's a physical component, and Moshe does both. It depends on which battle. And it's interesting because it's not like when he was an old man he went to pray. No, when he was an old man he went to war. He led the war. When he was a young man, he went to pray. It's just interesting. I wouldn't expect it to turn out that way. But now that you raise it, Doctor, it's interesting to see that Moshe sometimes prayed and set the example that yes, we're going to war, but we also rely on a higher power. And it was very important for him to display that higher power, that we're dependent on a higher power, and he saw that as his role. But other times, when it was necessary, he himself, when the Jews were under threat, he led the battle against Sichon and Og, the two mightiest kings. And it wasn't like he led them because he wasn't afraid. He was afraid, right? The Torah says he was afraid, and God has to come and say, don't be afraid. Now, if God tells you don't be afraid, what does that mean? It means you're afraid, right? So that's interesting. Okay, the final section of the parsha, and therefore the final section of the fourth book, seems like it's just a technicality that we have to deal with. But really, well, hopefully, but it makes sense to say that there's actually a much deeper message here, and there's actually not just a technicality, but it's an important theme that the Torah is coming back to and finishing the fourth book about this theme. I want to just say that I'm getting very excited about finishing the fourth book because, as I mentioned in the past, in a way, this is the conclusion of the Torah. Because the fifth book is a repetition. It's Moshe repeating. It's Moshe's last 37 days of Moshe's life. He gives a speech. And in this speech, he repeats. What does he repeat? The history of the last 40 years and many of the commandments. He restates the commandments. And it tells you of the events of the last day of Moshe's life. But in a way, in a very important way, the Torah concludes at the end of the fourth book. The fifth book is called Mishneh Torah, repetition of the Torah. In English, from Greek, it's called Deuteronomy, the second law. Because it's the second law, because it's the restatement, it's the repetition. So in a way, this is the conclusion. And what's the conclusion? What are we going to talk about? So we have a technical thing to talk about. What are we talking about? So we have the daughters of Tzalafchad marry within their own tribe of Menashe, so that the estate which they inherit from their father should not pass to the province of another tribe. So to understand this, you have to look at last week. What happened last week is there's 5 girls whose father passes away. They have no brothers, and up to that point, only males could inherit land in Israel. Only males could inherit land. And they come to Moshe and they say, we want to inherit. And God says they're right. So now what happens is that so God says they'll inherit the land of their father who's deceased. The problem is now the people of the tribe of Joseph, Menashe, the tribe of Joseph, who was their tribe, they come and they say, 1 second, what's going to happen is if they could marry people from a different tribe, and now the tribe follows the father, not the mother. So now when they have children, the land from our tribe will be transferred to another tribe in the next generation. So God says, Moshe says, they're right. And when they marry, they should marry people from their own tribe. So the land will stay within the tribe. And that's the conclusion of the parsha. It sounds like a technical thing, but maybe there's a bigger theme over here. And if you're curious, by the way, the Torah says that was only that law, that year, that first generation. When they entered into the land, the division of the tribes was supposed to be absolute. So if a woman is going to inherit land, that first generation, she should only marry someone from their own tribe. But afterward, it was supposed to be a certain blurring of the lines of the tribes. And therefore, a woman who inherited land was not required to marry someone from her own tribe. And it's okay if some of the land is transferred from tribe to tribe. It's not a tragedy, right? When you go in, you want to be rooted in your own tribe. But afterward, tribes could mingle a little bit more. So that's how the parsha concludes. There's a lot of big themes here, a lot of big ideas, but we have to start somewhere. So here we are. Comments, questions, jokes, comments, please share. Otherwise, we begin. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. The beginning is all of a sudden the portion opens, and Moshe calls the leaders of the tribes and says, "These are the laws of how you nullify the vows." In other words, the first thing is a person makes a vow, you have to keep your vow. It has a force of law. And the way that if I say I'm not going to do something and I make a vow, I'm not allowed to do that. But then there's a mechanism to undo the vow. And it's interesting that written Torah only writes the mechanism for a woman, a young woman, or an unmarried woman. So if a young girl makes a vow till she's 12 years old, the father could nullify the vow. If a married woman makes a vow, then the husband could nullify the vow. That is, both the father and the mother, and both the father and the husband have 1 day, 24 hours, to nullify the vow. If they don't nullify the vow is binding. That's what the Torah says. But the sages say, they learn it from the verses here. The sages say that there's another way to nullify the vow, which applies both to men and to women, and it does not have a limit of 24 hours, anytime. It could be done anytime. And that is if you go to the sage, if you go to court, and you speak to the sage, and the sage speaks to you, and you realize there's a way to realize that if the vow was predicated on a mistake, it's not binding, right? If you make a contract and you sign a contract and it's predicated on a mistake, it's not binding. So the vow is the same thing. If it's predicated on a mistake, it's not binding. So the point is, I say, had I known that making this vow would cause this tension in my life, I would not have made the vow. So the court says, okay, so then it's on a mistaken premise. If it's on a mistaken premise, it's not binding. Now I can't do it for myself. The court has to do it for me, and that's called hatarat nedarim, undoing the vows. And it's one of those examples of the oral Torah, because the Torah does not say this. Torah says father, husband. Torah does not say sage, but the sages insist that they derive it. It says you should not nullify your own vow, but the court can do it for you. And there's a whole tractate in the Talmud behind me, a tractate in the Nedarim, tractate to vows, that talks all about the laws of vows. It's a big deal. And now the question is, what does it mean? And what does it mean to us? And more importantly, why is it being said right now at this point? And the question is, are vows a good thing or a bad thing? And if they're a good thing, why could they be nullified? And if they're a bad thing, why is there a mechanism to create a vow? Because a vow is binding. A vow is, let's say somebody says, I'm not going to eat any more chocolate cake. And he says, chocolate cake, now, and if you really make a vow, then it's like a prohibition. It's like eating something that's not kosher. It's a serious matter. So who decided that I have the power to make something, to prohibit something, and then there's a mechanism to undo that prohibition? And most importantly, that sounds like religious law. A lot of the religious law is in the third book of the Torah. Ritual laws in the third book of the Torah. Why is this right here in the story, right here, where they're at the Jordan River, about to think about how to divide the land of Israel, the borders of the land? It doesn't seem like the time to talk about vows. So that is the question, which is an introduction to the big idea. The big idea is that the laws of vows are very important to where we are in the story right now. Where are we in the story right now? We're transitioning from the desert to the land of Israel. If you count the Jewish people who are going to be in Israel after this point in the story, if I had to guess, I would say 67 days later, they would be in Israel, right? So in other words, 69 days later, 67, 70 days later, they'll be in Israel. So in other words, this is a matter of a very short period of time they're going to be in Israel. So when you think about crossing into the land of Israel, you have to think about the concept of vows. Where do I see this? So let's step back a second also to the last parsha. What happens in last parsha? Last parsha was the story of Pinchas. There was a terrible plague because the Jewish people strayed after the daughters of Moab, who enticed them to adultery and to serving idols. The problem is like this. The problem is the Jewish people were, in a way, secluded in the desert for 40 years. And now they reach civilization. And when they reach civilization, they get so excited and they're sort of blinded by the lure of the materialism that they want to fully engage in materialism. And what that led to idol worship and adultery. And now we're going into Israel. And what's in Israel is more of the same. More of the same, meaning there's a civilization there are cultures there's 7 nations. And even though the Jewish people over the next 14 years conquered most of it, they didn't conquer all of it. And there's certainly pockets of places that were not conquered. And if you read the future books of the Bible, which is Joshua and which is Judges, all you hear about is, and Kings also, but that's another story, for the next 400 years is just the story of how the people are being influenced by their surrounding cultures to serve idols, right? And to be influenced by their ways. And then they were pulled away, and then there's oppression, and there's war, and then God helps them, and then they straighten up spiritually, and then 40 years later, they fall back into the idol worship. It was not a simple matter, is what I'm trying to say. In the desert, everything was fine. The last 38 years, you heard about it, there was no problems. What are we doing? You can't sin. You're in the desert. What are you going to do? But now they're coming to civilization, and you have all the trappings, temptations and trappings of civilization, and now that's a spiritual threat. So what do you do when you have a spiritual threat? So there's 2 steps. Step number 1 is you have to make sure that the materialism that you engage in, the physical world, the blessings that God gives you, you have to make sure that they're serving you, you're not serving it, right? A person has assets, a person has possessions, a person has a beautiful car, beautiful boat. There's 2 ways to have it. One way is that's serving me, that's enhancing my life. Another way is I'm enslaved to my possessions. And that means I worry about it. That means it distracts me from other things I should be doing. I can't think about my family. So that's the challenge of engaging in civilization and being successful is, am I controlling it or is it controlling me? Right? I said to somebody the other week, I said, the only thing better, they say that there's only one thing in the world better than having a boat. And that is having a friend with a boat. Because if you have a boat, you have to take care of the boat a whole day. You don't have time to do anything else. So the point here is that anything in life is, I'm serving it or is it serving me? So what's the test? How do I know if I'm serving it or it's serving me? The other guy, I want to tell you the end of the story because I'm being recorded. The guy said, yeah, having a boat is like having another wife. I guess that's not a nice joke, but that's what he said. You're very busy. It takes up all your time. I shouldn't have said that. But the point is this. The point is, you have certain things. It's supposed to make you feel better. It's supposed to enhance you, but it also traps you. Oh, this is what I wanted to say. I wanted to say what the ethics of the fathers say, which says, the more possessions, the more worry, right? And King Solomon already said it even before. He says, somebody who's a poor laborer, at least when he sleeps, his sleep is sweet. He has nothing to worry about. But somebody has assets all over the world. How could you sleep? You're worrying about it. Now, we're nothing against assets. You should have assets, but you shouldn't worry about them, because if you worry about them, then you're worse off than the laborer who has nothing, right? So how do I get to this position? What do I know? How do I put myself in, or what's the test, whether I'm controlling it or it's controlling me? So the answer is, I think, the answer is, the test is, if I could say no, if I could turn it off, if I could say, if I'm in control, is that I could say no. When just because this presents itself to me, I have to be able to say no, right? Let's say I like coffee. Every time I walk by a coffee machine, I make a coffee. What does that mean? It means that I'm addicted. I have no control. But if I can walk by the coffee machine and say, you know what, I'm not having a coffee now. So I could say no. If I could say no, I'm in control. And then I decide how much I want to use this, right? But anything physical is that way. Anything in the physical world, it's a question of the ability to say no. And if you can't say no, if I'm an alcoholic, God forbid, I can't say no. If I can't say no, then I'm in trouble. If I could say no, then I could use it in moderation. If I'm using it in moderation, then it's serving me, I'm not serving it. Okay. So now what is the Torah saying? The purpose of Judaism is not to separate from the materialism. To the contrary. And that's why, if you think about this, I always like to say that Judaism is not a religion, because religion thinks about the idea of how do you escape from the physical and become more spiritual. That's what religion is about. But Judaism is almost the opposite. Yes, we have to become more spiritual, but the purpose of Judaism is to sanctify the physical, to use the physical for a holy purpose. It's completely different. You're eating food, you make a blessing, you eat it for a holy purpose, you make it holy. So the point of the physical of Judaism is to bring holiness to the physical world as opposed to escape from the physical world. Does that make sense? Is that radical enough? Yeah? So in a way, it's the opposite of religion. Religion is, I want to become more spiritual. Judaism, yeah, you may want to become more spiritual, but the purpose is not to be in heaven. If the purpose was to be in heaven, then you don't have to be created. The purpose is here on earth. To do what? To sanctify the physical. So if I have more possessions, I have more work. I have to bring holiness to more experiences. right? If I have nothing, if I'm sitting in my study hall all day and I learn, it's not so hard. But if I have possessions and I have a summer home and I have a winter home, then I have to bring holiness to more places, to more experiences. You have to have a greater spiritual capacity. By the way, so you have to have a greater spiritual capacity. There's a Talmud that says Rebbe, the author of the Mishnah, one of the greatest sages who ever lived, he used to honor wealthy people. They thought, why does he have to honor wealthy people? Because he needed a donation for the building fund? No, he was extremely wealthy himself. But the Hasidic commentary says, wealth means that God is giving you opportunity and therefore responsibility to bring holiness to so many more experiences. So obviously you have more spiritual potential. So Rebbe honors the people with the spiritual potential that God honors. Now, it doesn't mean they use that potential. That's another story. But it means that when you look at wealth, not as a distraction from the purpose of creation, but to the contrary. The whole purpose of creation is to bring blessing, to bring holiness to the material world. So that is in the ideal world, but in the practical world, it's not so simple, because sometimes I'm so busy trying to. I may tell myself I'm trying to engage in elevating the physical, but really the physical could be trapping me. So how do I know? So what do I do? In other words, how do I know maybe this is actually distracting me from my spiritual purpose? So the answer is sometimes you have to say no. Sometimes I have to say, this for me is not good. And that's when I make a vow. Like, I know that this is not good for me. I know if I walk by the bakery, I'm going to buy too many donuts. So I know I know that I can elevate it. This experience, I cannot elevate it. It's going to pull me down. So what do? The goal is to elevate everything in my life, but I can't. Let's say some relationship I have. This relationship is not healthy. I call my brother. Every time I call, we fight. Okay, so I'm supposed to have a meaningful relationship, but I can't. And in fact, it's pulling me down. So what do? So here there's a mechanism which is called make an oath. Make an oath says, I'm making an oath. This is serious. And just like I wouldn't consider doing something against God's will, I say, for this period of time, I now am separating from this experience. These things I'm not doing. I'm not getting close to this. Let's say I'd say, I'm never going to eat cotton candy again. Fill in the blank, whatever your cotton candy is. That takes the force of an oath. It's a serious matter. It's going to force me. It's going to reinforce my commitment to separate from it. But what's the point of separation? Because for me, I have to separate. Because even though in the ideal world, the ideal is to elevate and not separate, but practically for me, I cannot elevate this. It's going to pull me down. So that's why we have the mechanism of the oath. And then we talk about the undoing of the oath, but that's the next step. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin.
Rabbi, what does Torah or Kabbalah teach us about the value of verbalizing a vow or oath, or writing down a vow or oath, versus just saying it to ourselves? Clearly, in a wedding, a vow has to be verbalized.
Yeah.
But what about the issue of verbally and written down as compared to just something between you and yourself?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So Judaism. So the answer is, let's start with the practical. The practical is that a vow is only binding if you verbalize it. The person has to say, not if I think, oh, maybe it's a good idea to make a vow. No, you have to verbalize it. And Judaism is a strong believer in the spoken word. And we take the spoken word very seriously. And the reason is, there's spiritual reasons, there's psychological reasons. In some ways, when it's still in your head, it's in your head. But if it's in your real world, if you speak it into the universe and you could hear it as something outside of just a voice in your brain, then it's more concrete. And if it's more concrete, it has an effect on you. And Hasidism talks about this, and they say that you could see this sometimes when you, maybe you could see this from your own experience, that sometimes words actually strengthen the spiritual experience. So for example, in other words, like this, the conventional interpretation of words, just to give you a little Kabbalah here, why not? So there's 10 sefirot, 10 divine attributes that are reflected in the 10 attributes of the soul. And the lowest of those attributes is called Malchut, kingship, which the Kabbalah says is synonymous with speech. Because speech, in a way, is the lowest aspect of your soul, because it's the aspect of your soul that you really don't need for yourself. It's about communicating with other people, right? Let's say I can't speak, or I have no one to speak to. I could still think, I could still feel. I'm not speaking, so big deal. Speech in a way is for the other person. If I lived on an island alone, I wouldn't have to speak, right? So speech in a way is very outside of myself. Yet you see, says the Kabbalah, Hasidism especially, you see that speech has its power, and that's related to the Kabbalistic concept that the lowest is rooted in the highest. Speech is the lowest, but it has a very deep impact. And therefore, the Kabbalah says, you will see psychologically within yourself, with your own experience, I don't mean psychologically, I mean within your own experience, you will see that when you speak, speech has the power to actually intensify both thoughts and emotions. So let's say I think about an idea. Until you verbalize it, you don't fully understand it. When you have to verbalize it to somebody else, that's when you understand it better. And the same thing is with feeling. You can have a feeling, I don't like this guy, I hate this person, or I love this person. When you talk about it and you verbalize it, it has the capacity to actually intensify the emotion or the idea. And that's the paradox that the Kabbalah is always saying, that the lowest is rooted in the highest, and the highest is rooted in the lowest. So the speech seems to be the lowest point, but it's actually is rooted very deep within the person. So we have this concept that when you verbalize it, it actually has an impact psychologically within the person, within the inner life of the person, either in his mind or in his heart, even more. But then there's a general concept, which is God created the world with speech. Torah says God said, and the world came into being. God said, let there be light, and there was light. And the Kabbalah teaches that you create your environment with your speech. If you speak words of kindness, you're living in a kind environment. That's what you're going to get in return. If you speak words of love, that's what you're going to get. So the speaking, both in the practical sense and more in the mystical sense, speaking has a tremendous power on the person and on the environment that the person is going to live in. And that's true for all types of speech. In other words, that's why when we pray, we're supposed to verbalize. Oath has to be verbalized, and many other things, like, let's say, Lashon Hara, evil speech is seen as something very severe, because speech does have a profound impact both on the person and on the environment. Go ahead, Doctor.
Rabbi, you actually answered exactly what I was going to pose, which is that one of the reasons why, since speech intensifies emotions and thought, that Lashon Hara would intensify negativity, and that's why we don't speak Lashon Hara, not just for the other person, but for ourselves.
Right. If I speak about this person in a negative sense, yeah, to me, I'm crystallizing, and I'm crystallizing my impression of that person to be negative, right? Because once it's spoken, it becomes real. And it becomes real both in the practical sense, both in the sense, the subjective sense, that it becomes more real for me, the subjective sense. But Judaism also teaches that speech has a certain power to bring out and express certain hidden potential. So if you want to go to the realm of the more mystical or the more intangible, when I speak something bad about the other person, I'm awakening that negativity within their soul, and it comes to the surface. Whereas if I speak positive about the person, then I'm actually awakening the positive aspects of that person. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You get what you speak. If I speak kind words, that elicits the kindness. If I speak negative words, it brings out the negativity. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. What is the practical lesson for us for taking a vow? For example, what if I don't want to separate from everything for forever? Just put a time component into it, just say take a break. Would it be a little bit milder? It will be easier to, and also, how is it done? How is it done and done?
So now it's better not to take vows. It's better not to take vows, because vows are very severe. Vows, that's another aspect we can ask of why they're so severe, and what vows are very severe. They only work because they're so severe, right? It's one of those, when a person takes a vow, they are saying it becomes like a prohibition. So the only reason why the vow works is because the stakes are high, right? It's a deterrent because the stakes are high, and it's considered a big sin to violate a vow. So that's why it's better not to take a vow if necessary, if you're able to avoid taking the vow. But the vow is just the extreme expression of the concept of separation, of being able to tell the self, I have enough self-awareness to know that although maybe for other people this is okay, for me, this does not enhance my spiritual well-being. This is a distraction to my well-being. right? Some people in everything. Today we're being inundated with technology or forms of technology, but in the modern life in general, does this bring me closer to my values? Does this bring me closer to being able to be there for my family, or does it distract? And the answer, there is no one answer for everybody, right? If it's a prohibition, it's a prohibition for everybody. But the whole point here is that when you come to civilization, most of civilization is neutral. It's not a prohibition. It's not a mitzvah. It's in the middle ground. It's a neutral ground. It's not really neutral because everything has to be done for a purpose. But the point is, it's not a prohibition and it's not a mitzvah. Now, what's the purpose of all this neutral space? The purpose is that we, through our engaging in that space, to bring holiness to that space. But then, for some people, certain aspects of that neutral space is not neutral at all, but rather it is distracting. And it's not only I will not able to elevate it, but it will pull me down. So now I have to know that a very important tool is you don't have to engage, and you have to, in some ways, be disciplined and not engage. And that's what the vow is. Now, what's part of this whole idea here is that therefore the Torah builds into the story of the vow the mechanism to undo the vow, because undo the vow represents the greater spiritual wholesome experience. After I say no, I could say yes. Right? If I come and say, I'm not doing this, so now I'm in control. Now, once you're in control, then you go to the father or to the husband or to the to the sage. And what they're doing, it's not just a technicality. They're saying, oh, you don't have to, we're nullifying the vow. What they're really doing is elevating you to a higher plane, to a more spiritual space where you no longer need the vow. Because now, if you could say no, you could say then at the right time, not saying immediately. Some people for their whole life can't say yes. Some people would say that if a person is an alcoholic, they should never get too close to the wine. Whatever the case is, I'm not an expert in every individual person. The whole point is that this is individual. This is for individual. This is tailored for every individual. But the point is, the goal would be, the higher level would be that to be able to move from the place of vow, which is I cannot engage because it's going to pull me down, to the idea that once I say no, once I am in control, then I could say yes, because now the yes, I'm saying yes. I'm not being reactive. I'm being proactive. I decide when I want to do this, right? I decide when I want to engage in this, as opposed to it's controlling me. So once I have the ability to say no, then I get the ability to really expand spiritually and be able to ultimately nullify the vow. And nullifying the vow is ultimately the purpose, which would be to elevate, to engage with this experience and elevate it. Now, not everybody has to engage with everything. For some people, that's not my business. I can't do it. It's too complex for me. I don't have to do it. But the idea that the Torah gives a path to the undoing of the vow is because ultimately the purpose is not to separate. Sometimes it's necessary because I have a weakness to this to this negativity. And if I don't take control, if I'm not disciplined, it's going to swallow me up. So I have the mechanism of the vow, but then I have the mechanism of undoing the vow. But the whole point here is, not the whole point, but one important point is, why is this being said right now, right before we're about to cross into the land of Israel? Because there's two ways to say this. Because now we're approaching the civilization, we have to know how to deal with the civilization. Another way to think about it, when we were in the desert for 40 years, it was like the state of the vow. We were separated. And now we're going to the state of engagement in the world. So in a way, we're moving from the vow to undoing the vow. That's, if you want to say, the collective picture. But the practical side is, right now, it's necessary to deal with this. How do I know? Because the case in point, look at this last parsha. There was the tragedy. The people came in and they were blinded by the allure of the materialism, and boom, within moments, they were already committing all the most terrible sins. Why? Because they had no experience of saying no. They were taught whatever the case is. They didn't realize that sometimes engaging in the world doesn't necessarily mean being controlled by the world. In fact, it doesn't mean that. And if you're controlled by the world, you can't engage with it and you can't elevate it. So that's the reason that right now, at this point, when we're transitioning from life in the desert to life in Israel, which is a life of not being spiritual, but a life of sanctifying civilization, sanctifying agriculture, sanctifying the country we're about to build, as opposed to be separate in the desert where there is no civilization, just relying on miracles or whatever. So now at this point, it's very important to highlight the concept of the vows, and more importantly, the undoing of the vows.
Beautiful. So basically what you're trying to say is, in nowadays, if we can develop that skill that allows us without just bypass the vow. And
Yes. If you need a vow, you can maybe think about making a vow, but it's better not to, because the stakes are too high. The stakes are too high. But the point is the attitude of the vow. Yeah, this is not for me. You know, that's what they tell you. They tell you when you sign up to Weight Watchers. But in general, they say this: don't rely on self-control, because over time, self-control is going to weaken, right? If I buy the donuts and I put it on my counter and have self-control, every hour of self-control actually makes me weaker, because it gets harder and harder, and then at the end of the day, I may succumb. So what do? You what they tell you is, when you go to the store, don't buy the donut to begin with. In other words, separate yourself. And if you separate from yourself, you're not going to be bothered by the pull. Now, donuts are very good, because once in a while, you have to eat a little bit of junk, eat a little piece of chocolate, and it makes you happy. And if you're happy, you can go call up your friend because you're so happy now, right? So a little bit moderation, all these things, everything in this world, almost everything, anything that's not a prohibition, could be used for the positive. But the point here is, you have to understand that I have to be able to be in control of how it's being used and when it's being used, because if I'm not controlling it, it's controlling me. And the way to know if I'm controlling it or I'm controlling it is to be able to say no. Now, all the addicts, the doctor will correct me if I'm wrong, all the addicts, what they all say, and it doesn't matter what the addiction is to, everyone will say, if I wanted, I could stop. Now, sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not true. I'm not here to judge. But the test is, if you can't stop, you're not in control. And Nidarim is the vows, is the idea that I have to be able to be enough self-aware and say, this does not help my family. This does not help my relationship. Maybe it's enjoyable. Maybe it's exciting. Maybe for other people, it's good for them, right? It's not a judgment to somebody else. Someone else could be I would say, on a higher level, that they could have I don't know, what do people have? They could have a 90-foot yacht and they still have time for their kids. Okay, for some people they can do that. I'm not on that level. Right? So I have to be able to know that I can't. Again, fill in the blank. The example is not important. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
What does Torah and Kabbalah say is the difference, if they do, between a verbal commitment and a vow?
So commitment is there could be a verbal commitment to somebody else, and if the verbal commitment is somebody else, then then you can't undo it, because it's not about your awareness. It's about once you make it public to somebody else, then it's about their awareness as well. So you can't change that. The vow is for myself. So all things about myself, if I make a vow about myself, then I could go back and change it, because if I'm a different person now, if I've changed, right? Now this is not a distraction for me. I have changed. Again, the basic element of undoing the vow is, had I got this new information, I wouldn't have made the vow. Right? So I grew, I'm a different person, but that's only because it's only relevant to me. Once it's verbalized to a second party, then my changing of my perspective doesn't matter, because what's important is, like they say in communications, it doesn't matter what you say, it matters what the other person heard. Right? So if it's a commitment to somebody else, then you can't play around. By the way, we have this notion of Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur, and people do it a little bit different than the day before Rosh Hashanah, where we nullify the vows. And throughout the years, it wasn't clear, that it was controversial whether it should be said or it shouldn't be said. But I don't want to go into that right now. I just want to say there's a lot of hate and a lot of anti-Semitism. A lot of anti-Semites said you can't trust the Jews, because once a year they go to shul and they nullify all their vows, and all they say, everything they promised to you is out the window. And this was a serious problem, because it caused a lot of problems to the Jews. Now the reality is that is not correct. If you make a commitment to somebody else, there's no going to synagogue and saying any statement and changing it, or going to the court and changing it. It doesn't work. This is only things that you say for yourself, because then it's based on your awareness and your perspective. But once it's verbalized to somebody else, once it's said to somebody else, in other words, if it's about the other person, if it's a commitment to somebody else, then their state of mind matters. And this has ramifications about even in the law today. When you write a contract, and they want to know what did it mean, so they ask what was the state of mind of the parties. You have to have a meeting of the minds. If I thought one thing, you thought something else, so then you have to go to the judge to decide. But the bottom line is, once I'm conveying it to somebody else, then that person's perspective is critical. Go ahead. Do you want to add something, Doctor?
Yes, and it may be obvious to Vicky and to Randy, but I never understood until this moment the difference between a vow and a commitment. And I never understood that a vow is really internal and doesn't involve someone else.
Right.
I
So
never
I guess
realized that.
maybe in English, vow doesn't mean that, but I'm just saying the way it's spoken in Jewish culture, a neder is for myself. I say this object is for me like a prohibition. That's what a vow is. This is
I wonder how much in the high holidays that distinction's ever made, because until this moment I never made that distinction, and I'm 87 years old.
Okay. You've got plenty of time to learn. Don't worry about it. I just want to say, if you want to talk about Yom Kippur, part of what Yom Kippur is, you could tell releasing of the vows, undoing the vows. You could look at it as a technical thing, but if you want to look at it from the perspective of Kabbalah, what we're saying is Yom Kippur, we're saying we're underlying the vows. Basically, on Yom Kippur, you can tap into the energy, and something that before, up until this point, was a distraction, and you needed a vow, now is no longer a distraction. Now you could elevate it, you can engage with it and elevate it with the power of the holiness of Yom Kippur. So it's an interesting thing that the nullifying of the vows has a technical ramification, but it also has a spiritual ramification, because the symbolism of the vow is, again, that I cannot elevate, I have to separate. And for many people and many times that is correct, because if I don't take the vow, it's going to swallow me up and it's going to cause me terrible a spiritual downfall. And not only spiritual, also physical, right? It could be self, if anything gets not regulated, could lead to self-destruction. And then the nullifying of the vow is the releasing me and saying that now, once I said no, I now could say yes. And they say yes means I can engage, and engage means I could elevate. So that is one major point that, even though it's in the parsha, just 2-3 pages, but it's an important point, and it's important to understand that this law is not just a law. It's a way of life, and it's critical specifically at this point in the journey when the people were moving from the desert to the civilization. Beautiful, Anna. Okay. Now there's a lot more to say, but we only have 6 minutes. So I want to say something, again, a big idea, and again, connected to the end of the book. And we'll do as we usually do, which is we'll read the last verse of the book and say, Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek, be strong, and maybe be strengthened. And that will be our celebration of concluding the 4th book. And after that, next week, we come again for the 5th book. But again, what's the next big thing? So the next big thing is this concept of the 2.5 tribes that want to remain east of the Jordan, which is a strange story. It's a strange story because there's technical matters that are strange. Why would Moshe want to allow them? Why would God allow them? He didn't even ask God. It doesn't say that he asked God. He just made the deal with him himself. He cut the deal by himself. And another strange story is, I alluded to it by asking the question, which is, why would Moshe, who was reluctant at best to give the 2 tribes the land east of the Jordan, why would he take Manasseh, who did not ask to be put east of the Jordan, and why did he add Manasseh and put them east of the Jordan, outside of Israel? Like, they didn't ask for it. Why is he doing it? If it's a bad thing, or if it's less than the ideal, why is he putting them there? So there's a lot to say about all of this, but what I'm going to say is very simple. Being outside of the land of Israel represents the ability of the Jewish people that is relevant to us. I think everybody here who is not living in the land of Israel. The idea that we can bring the holiness not just within the strict borders of the land of Israel, but we could spread the holiness to outside of Israel. So when the 2 tribes come and say we want to be outside of Israel, and if Moshe agrees, what is that saying? that's saying that holiness is not confined to a specific time and place or a specific place. We have the ability to bring the holiness to the land of Israel outside of Israel. In a way, it's the bridge to the rest of the world. If you can be east of the Jordan, we can also be in Iraq. We could be in Babylonia. And if we be in Babylonia, we can be in Ashkenaz, in Western Europe. And if we in Western Europe, we could be in Eastern Europe, and then we can make it to the United States and live in Greenwich and bring the holiness to Greenwich. But that's all based on the precedent that the Jewish people could get their portion. It's not just technical exile. We were exiled. No, their portion in life, that's where God wants them to be, is the east of the Jordan, right? So that's a big deal, right? That's a big deal. It's a big story. It's big news. It's surprising. It's actually surprising. Moshe is dying his entire career. He really wants to get into the land of Israel. God won't allow him. God says you could stand on the mountains in Jordan and see Israel, but you can't go in. And he keeps asking God, and he's going to ask God again in 2 weeks from now. The point here is that Moshe is dying to get in, and these tribes are saying we want to be east of the Jordan. We don't want to go in. So you can say, oh, they're out of touch, or you could say no, they're expanding the holiness outside of Israel. So it's surprising that they ask. Okay, but however, Moshe understands even on a practical sense that I'd say two things. I'd say, yeah, there's a danger that people east of the Jordan will drift away and they sort of break away and make their own kingdom. Because Israel divided into two kingdoms after the days of King David, King Solomon, David's son, King Solomon, his son, Rechavam, the kingdom split, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. But there could have been another split. There could have been the Jordan, which is a geographical, which is a physical border, the Jordan River, could have divided those two tribes east of the Jordan. You have your own tribe. It could have been a threat that two of the tribes would become their own people. So what does Moshe do? He takes a tribe, half the tribe on each side. Now they have a bridge. Menashe, half Menashe is east of the Jordan, half Menashe is west of the Jordan. Menashe keeps going back and forth. They have to make sure there's a bridge over the Jordan, right? Because you want to be part of your tribe, and your tribe is split. So Menashe serves as the bridge connecting the holiness of Israel to the people outside of Israel. And that ensures that they're not going to break up into two kingdoms. In a way, the people who are outside of Israel have to be connected to Israel even more. So Menashe, who's serving as the bridge, has to be really connected to Israel. And that's another sub-theme that you have in the end of the parsha is, we keep talking about the daughters of Tzalafchad. They're the daughters of Menashe, the son of Joseph. They're the daughters of Joseph. And all the Medrash talks about is Joseph loved the land of Israel and his daughters loved the land of Israel. And for the Jewish people, they were reluctant to go into the land of Israel. They weren't sure, the spies, they didn't want to go. And here you see an example of people who are in love with the land of Israel. And they're the daughters of Tzalafchad. And the daughters of Tzalafchad, so Menashe, who loves the sons of Joseph, who loves Israel, become the bridge between Israel and outside of Israel. And within Menashe itself, it's the daughters of Menashe which inherit land, and the sages explain that they got portion on both sides of the land. So when we talk about the daughters of Tzalafchad, it's not just a technical thing. What are we going to do with these 5 women? Who are they going to marry? What it's really telling us is that when we get to the holiness, when we get to the end of the book, and we're talking about going into Israel, and Israel is a holy place, we cannot forget that it's not just about Israel, it's also about rectifying the rest of the world, sanctifying the rest of the world. And who's the example of the people who did this is the 2 tribes through the help of Menashe, who was split, and specifically the daughters of Menashe. So that's how this end of the parsha, which seems like a technicality, is not really a technicality. It's really telling us the mission of Judaism, and for us it's even more important because we happen to be living outside of Israel, and in a way we're doing the mission of Menashe, of the tribe of Menashe, and the tribe of the other 2 tribes, which is we're bringing the holiness of Israel to the rest of the world. And that's the Hasidic saying that once upon a time there was a Chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, Third Chabad Rebbe, Menachem Mendel, and this is in the early 1800s, and he wanted to move to the land of Israel. And he told his Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, I want to go to Israel. So the Rebbe said, why do you have to go to Israel? Mach da Eretz Yisrael, make Israel here. One way is to go to Israel, and another way is to make Greenwich Israel. So that's what we're trying to do here. So I'm just going to read the last verse, so we could say that we could talk about the daughters of Tzalafchad, the daughters of Joseph, the daughters of Menashe, the son of Joseph, and then we could talk about the final verse, which is describes a summary of all the commandments that God spoke to them when they were at the plains of on the Jordan River, at the plains of Moab, on the Jordan opposite Jericho, and they're about to cross. There's only going to be a 37-day break, which is the fifth book, which is Moshe's speech, and then 30 days for Moshe's, when they mourned the passing of Moshe. And after the 30 days of mourning the passing of Moshe, they had 3 days to prepare the crossing, and then they crossed. Okay, I'm going to just read the last two verses. The last three verses, verse 11. Tzlafchad's daughters, Malka, Tirza, Milka, Machla, Tirza, Chagla, Milka, and Noah, married their cousins. They married into the families of the sons of Menashe, son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained with the tribe of their father's family. And finally, the final verse. These are the commandments and the ordinances that God commanded the Israelites through Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan River opposite Jericho. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, be strong, and may we be strengthened. And thank you all for joining today and concluding the fourth book together. And we should have much strength and peace of mind to continue on to the fifth book and to many more books in good health for many long years to come. Thank you all. Okay, I think you're on mute, Doctor.
Oh, we're meeting on Friday.
God willing, yes, and good health, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you,
good day.
Rabbi.
Thank you.